Hello friends, this is Growl. We have two pretty big patches coming up over the last week. One is a class tuning patch, the other is a balance tuning patch for dungeons and raids. It's actually really cool to see Blizzard still putting in some love this late into the tier. Normally I don't expect them to do any sorts of big changes and for them to be working on the next raid. So obviously we know they're working on the next raid, and seeing them do this stuff is awesome. I think they've definitely stepped up this expansion in providing good balance of both classes and dungeons and raids. I think that classes are a really hard spot to balance. I know people might be upset when I say they've done a good job balancing classes because you play one random class that isn't popular, but there's so many specs and I don't think there's any really super big outliers right now. If you're not familiar with the way Blizzard does balancing, they generally do all of their balancing around the release of the Mythic Raid. This is because they don't want to have guilds progressing on the raid and then having some of their important players or important roles nerfed during progression and then have to sort of either decide to like bench somebody or re-roll. However, the changes that they do make are sort of some slight quality of life improvements to some of the less popular specs. So that's why, if you're wondering why we don't see any big nerfs to, whatever class that you think is OP right now, that's probably why. Most of the tuning changes they do are either strictly PvP focused that may affect the, the arena championships or whatever, or just slight buffs to some of the underperforming specs. So before we look at the list, we're going to look at the top 5% parses for each class. This is also posted on Wowhead a little bit before this, and this will give us some insight as to what they're using. You may wonder, if you're not primarily a Mythic Raider, why some of these changes happen, or maybe why your class didn't get covered, and this chart will pretty much explain all of it. So right now we see the two biggest outliers are Balanced Druid and Aflock. I'm a little surprised to see Aflock. It does really good sustained single target damage, but you don't really see it too much in keys, even for that, and I guess it's showing some play in PvP. Balanced Druid is definitely, I think, an outlier in most content right now. I think, even though I don't expect any nerfs, if there is a target, it would be Balanced Druid. Fire Mage, although it's performing very well in keys, along with Windwalker Monk, is, only on the top end of raid, wouldn't necessarily be an outlier. Some surprising specs in here. We see Shadow Priest, Feral Druid. I'm not too sure how to interpret this, but either way, now we see the bottom specs here, and we sort of see the difference too. So when you see these 5% buffs, 3% buffs, you can kind of come into context that these aren't going to completely change the meta here. For example, most of these specs under, anything under Frost Mage, even if it gets a 5% buff, isn't even going to be in the top half of specs for DPS right now. Again, this list should be taken with a grain of salt. This isn't the end-all be-all of how good your spec is, but it's something interesting to look at if you're, kind of wondering where they're getting these numbers or why they chose the specs they chose. Okay, so let's quickly go through the buffs. Frost Decay buffed by 5%. I think this is understandable. We don't see pretty much any Frost Decays in Mythic Plus or Raid, and although I don't think this will change the meta too much, it'll be a nice improvement if you're playing the spec. Sort of the same line for Havoc. I think one of the big problems with Havoc is its single target damage. It actually does pretty good AoE and like cleave damage. So when you're going on a dungeon run, Havoc Demon Hunter will still have like an okay overall. They'll still be competing with some of the other specs. The issue is they can't do that really heavy priority damage, that really heavy single target damage that you can get from a class like Fire Mage or Boomkin. So that's why you're not seeing Havoc. I think, a 3% flat increase probably won't do nearly enough, or any flat increase isn't what you want really for Havoc, but at the same time, they don't want to do any big reworks or changes, so at least we get something. Both Hunter specs, other than MM, have been buffed. BM and Survival. I think BM actually isn't that bad of a spec right now. It's very unpopular just because of how good Marksman is, but at the same time, I think BM is more or less a viable spec still, and then having that 5% damage increase will at least have you able to compete with some of the other specs. Survival, I'll be honest, I don't know a whole lot about. I think it fits in line with Frost Decay in that I don't think it'll change much, but more damage will be nice. Keep in mind that although if you're playing one of these melee specs and you're looking for a big rework, Generally, DPS specs are brought by how much damage they have, especially with a class that doesn't have an absurd ability toolkit like a rogue for dungeons. I think damage buffs are actually what you want, because that would be the role that class like Frost DK or Survival Hunter fits. Like, you see Windwalker and Keys right now, and even a Windwalker paired with 2 casters, like Fire Mage and Boomkin, so you're not even bringing the Windwalker for the physical damage, you're just bringing Windwalker for how much damage it does. And so that's sort of the hope that all of the other melee specs have, is that you're just bringing it because it's doing a lot of damage. Frost Mage is buffed by 3%. This is actually kind of nice. I feel like Frost Mage isn't that far behind. Again, Frost Mage suffers similarly to BM Hunter in that it's just overshadowed because fire is so good. But especially with all the kiting that you have to do in Mythic Plus, having those Frost slows are really, really useful. So I don't think you're trolling at all when you're playing Frost Mage and Keys. In Raid, I still feel like fire is probably going to be better, especially if you need priority damage in specific windows. But again, just a quality of life improvement for Frost Mages. Sin Rogue's buffed by 5% as well. Sin Rogue just has not a very good damage profile for Mythic Plus, so they would need to be doing way, way more damage, I think, than Outlaw to be brought, just because Outlaw has that juicy, like, priority damage plus the cleave. However, again, 5% damage buff is nice. I don't know if we're going to see it overshadowing Sub or Outlaw anytime soon. Enhancement increased by 3%, almost the same as Survival. Frost, you know, just giving him a little bit more damage, hoping they'll see some play. Enhancement, I think, does okay damage as well. It's just that as a melee DPS right now, you need to be doing the best damage. Like, you may wonder why you see none of any of these melee specs like Frost DK, Enhancement Shaman. It's not that they're not viable, but having a melee, especially during weeks like Spiteful or Storming, is such a viability or a liability that you would only want it if it's doing insane damage. So basically either Windwalker or insane utility like Rogue brings. Destro damage increased by 5%. You see from that chart we looked at earlier, basically everyone is playing Affliction, just giving Destro a little bit more damage, although I don't know if that's going to change much. Arms and Fury both buffed by 3%. I think Fury Warrior, out of all the specs on this list, aside from maybe Frost Mage, is the closest to being viable in Keys right now. Fury actually does a lot of damage. It's really good right now, I would say, in both Raid and Mythic Plus. The biggest issue it has with Mythic Plus is just that damage profile. It doesn't have that same, like, you lose priority damage if you want to do AoE. So Fury, again, if you're doing a lot of damage, it could be viable. And I think of all these melee specs like Frost DK, Survival Hunter, Enhancement Shaman, like, I think Fury is on the top of all those, and it's definitely not trolling to bring it into Keys. At the same time, though, it's going to be hard. I think with all of the melee unfriendliness in the meta right now, it's really rough to bring a melee DPS in Keys at all. Okay, let's look at dungeon changes real quick. I don't want to spend too much time on these because there's a whole lot of them, but we will talk about them. I don't know what patch it was, but they also changed the followers in your mission table. So if you're a big mission table main, make sure you read your followers. I think they nerfed the Night Fae ones very hard, to the point where I woke up today and I can't even do any of my Night Fae missions now because my guys are just nerfed. Maybe a bit of an oversight there. I'm not saying that Night Fae guys weren't OP, but you know, it's like, what am I supposed to do now? Anyway, they made a lot of raid changes to Stone Legion, Sludge Fist, and Council, definitely smoothing out the difficulty. Our guild is progressing on Stone Legion right now, and these changes are very, very good. I feel like Stone Legion is not a difficult fight at all. It's still not my favorite fight. As a healer, I don't really like ad fights, but it's much better than it was. So if you're working through Mythic progression and you're worried about Stone Legion, these changes are very good. So they've made some changes to dungeons as well. They've made it so Prideful sees stealth and invisibility. I think people are, I don't know if this was in response to MDI, but this won't do anything because its sight range is limited, and so you just run past it and then use Shadow Meld. So I don't know what's going on with this. If anything, this will just hurt pugs, and it doesn't affect MDI at all. We have Plaguefall. I would say in my Twitch chat, one of the most common bosses that people need help with or that they struggle with is the last boss of Plaguefall, and these changes have significantly made the fight easier. So the ad is going to have 40% less health and damage. One of the big lose conditions of the fight is when there's 2 ads hurting your tanks. These ads hit really hard, and if your whole team is tunneling the boss, trying to phase the boss, and your tank is getting hit by 2 ads, that's what essentially will wipe you, is your either tank dying or the ads going loose. So seeing this ad nerf is very welcome. Also, they reduce the cast frequency of Infectious Rain. So what this means is, what happens normally is the boss will do a rain, and then it'll start doing tentacles, then it'll do a rain again immediately, like with more tentacles, and you'll have to heal the second rain while the tentacles are going off, and it's really tough. So they didn't really change that much, and it's like generally you'll have to heal through the same amount of rains as before, but the nice improvement is that you don't have to heal through this rain while the tentacles are going off. You sort of have a little bit of a window for you to stop and plant as a healer. This might not be something that's noticeable as a DPS, but as a healer, I saw this change right away when I was doing one of these runs yesterday. Slightly adjusted the plate crash, that's nice too. Sanguine depths, these flying guys give count. I guess no one ever pulls those on purpose. So these 2 bosses, a lot of people ask about different bosses, but I would say the first 2 bosses of Sanguine were the toughest bosses for me to heal personally. And this change reduces the damage of the smash and the absorption by 20%. I think it'll still be pretty hard. Like, this is a really hard boss on Tyrannical. If you're playing with a really good team and you just slam the boss in a minute, then it's done. And it's not too bad. But when you have to, let's say you're in a pug and you have to deal like 3 or even 4 casts of the Severing Smash, it's going to be really rough. And on top of that, if your first wipe is on Crixus, you're just dead. If you don't have Lust and Pride, the key's over immediately. Even with even if you're very well geared, just because this boss is so hard. Also, they reduced the health of the ad by 20%. This is a nice change. I think one of the biggest problems with this boss, in pugs especially, is that your DPS don't focus the ad fast enough. They're just, hitting the boss because, WoW is hard, and the ad is pulsing huge amounts of damage and people die. So this 20% not only will have the ad die faster, so there's less damage going out, but it'll also make the boss die faster because you don't need to commit as much damage to the ad to get it down. So this is a really good change. I'm okay with these bosses being harder bosses, but at the same time, I think they were a little bit of an outlier. Okay, we have the last 3 angels on Spires of Ascension. Their damage increasing aura is now 1% per stack instead of 2%. This is a pretty big deal. I think the damage of the last angel was just completely out of hand. This was one of the... I don't necessarily mind this really hard mob because the other stuff in this dungeon, like after the second boss, is pretty easy, assuming you're skipping it. So having this angel be like the last boss, I didn't necessarily mind, but at the same time, the damage was way out of hand, especially considering you have to do all the dodging with the charge spears. So I think this was a welcome change as well. The big topic, though, is the Necrotic Wake. They essentially nerfed like almost everything in this dungeon. I think they went a little bit overboard, but at the same time, this is a dungeon that's really tough for pugs, and the less coordination you have, exponentially the harder this dungeon gets. So the first thing they did, almost certainly in response to the MDI, is the Javelin and the Anima are now target capped on 8 enemies, meaning that if you do it on 20 enemies, it's still going to be doing the same amount of damage as 8, just split. Which I think is fine. It doesn't really affect pugs too often. It might be a bit obnoxious, but at the same time, these things do a lot of damage. So let's say you use them on a pack of 15 mobs, they'll still be doing tons of damage. The biggest change by far, the greatest quality of life change for pugs especially, is the items. The Javelin, the Anima, the Hammer now persist through death, meaning that let's say you grab a spear at the very beginning, you're not scared of holding the spear for what you want to use it for, And very often what will happen in Necrotic Wake is maybe 2 people will die and they'll both have items, and then you won't be able to continue, you won't be able to kill a boss or a tough pack that you wanted to do because you lost items. So now the dungeon is better balanced around these items, and that you can plan out where you're going to use them and you don't have to worry about dying. This is a great change for pugs especially, and now you can decide what to use it on instead of just like using it right away in fear that you'll lose it. So these brittlebone mobs, these are the ones with the necromancer, have been nerfed. Their damage was just way too high. When it said that these crossbowmen shoot was ignoring armor, if you watch my Necrotic Wake coaching video, I talk specifically about these crossbowmen and how they do so much damage. So maybe I didn't even know this was a thing, but this makes sense now. They've also nerfed Frostbolt Volley. This cast hurts really bad and its frequency is very high. Like one 12-second kick isn't enough to stop this. So seeing an increase to the cast time and a decrease to the damage is welcome. They've also nerfed a lot of the tougher mobs. Narzuda is the mini boss right before the bridge, and then a lot of this stuff is just the mobs throughout the dungeon. I think this is a little bit overboard. Talking about the mob health, maybe only this mini boss, since this mini boss is so rough. Maybe like these two, and then I would have maybe liked to see how the rest of the dungeon played out with these other changes. I think Necrotic Wake is going to be one of the best dungeons for high keys now. In pugs, I think it's now much more in line with the other dungeons, but and I think that's okay. A lot of high-end players think that the whole world should be balanced around them, but I understand that if in a dungeon that requires a lot of coordination, they might need to make it a little bit easier for the average crowd. And yeah, it might make the high-end keys imbalanced, but I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing anyway. You know, that's sort of, as the very small minority of the people that do high keys, I think it's something that we have to put up with. They've also increased this is the very first boss. Oh. Technical difficulties. Okay. They've also increased, this is the ads on the first boss. They now don't blow up until they hit 5 instead of 3. I mean, you basically just this lets your DPS stand and get hit by these. I don't know. This is like, I think a lot of people, especially DPS that are like new to the dungeon, don't even know this mechanic exists. Just see people standing and getting hit by these. I feel like maybe they should have made this a little bit less punishing as opposed to doing this. Like this basically just, I don't know, whatever. It's not that important of a change. So another really big change that they made was they reduced the range that the skeletons are spawning. It made it really hard because there's always 2 mages that were spawned with this cast on the second boss of Necrotic Wake, and you would have to track down the mages and interrupt their volley, or else things would get really bad. So having these skeletons spawn closer makes it much easier for your tank or your melee DPS to kick the volleys and to nuke them down quickly. So this was a very good change. They've also nerfed the Frostbolt Volley and the Crossman, similar to the Necromancer. Surgeon Stitchflesh, these are the pools, I think. They now no longer last 6 minutes instead of, or they last 1 minute now instead of 6, which I think is fine. If the fight is going 6 minutes, that's a little bit bad. I think that's, oh yeah, there were some PvP changes too. In my opinion, I'm definitely not a authority on PvP, so I'm not going to talk about that. The only thing I want to say is I don't have it on one of these, but they've made Torghast difficulty layers account wide. So let's say you're leveling up an alt. If you have layer 8 unlocked on your main, you can just walk right into layer 8 on your alt. You may need a buddy or something to help you, but at the same time, you can use that to get your soul ash more quickly. You won't have to spend, 10 hours in Torghast on that guy. So that covers most of the balance changes. I thought it'd be a good idea to go over both the dungeons and the class tuning and just give a little bit of my insight to help people understand not just how the changes affect things, but also what maybe some more insight as to what Blizzard's plan is or what to expect in the future. The one last thing that's obvious to point out is when I said that don't really expect any big balance changes or anything until the new raid or the end of the season. The next question is, well, when is that? I would guess usually they last about 6 months. So I would expect that these are going to be some of the last dungeon tuning changes of the season. And then we'll probably get an announcement of the next raid soon. I think if I had to bet, I would bet on a Kel'Thuzad Maldraxxus raid, but that's all, you know, that's all just speculation. I think that's going to come out in, let's say, end of March, early April sort of time. It could be delayed even longer depending on what their schedule is like, but if you're wondering either when the next big tuning changes are coming or how long do you have till Keystone Master, my guess would be about April is you'll see that next raid come out. So thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to subscribe to my channel. I don't do a whole lot of patch update reactions, but I thought this would be a good one because there's lots to talk about. I'm going to be working on some more videos and high-level Mythic Plus content in the future, and happy keying.